The third day. The third day in hell. March 1945. The ruins of an abandoned factory somewhere on the outskirts of Berlin. The air here had no taste, no smell. It simply existed. Thick, heavy, saturated with coal dust and the distant stench of char. It clogged the lungs, grated against the teeth, settled on the eyelashes. Captain John O'Connell sat with his back against a chipped concrete wall, staring at his hands. The calloused, strong hands of a pilot, made to grip the yoke of a flying fortress, not to tremble with hunger and helplessness. He looked at them as if seeing them for the first time, as if trying to remember who they belonged to. 4 men, all that was left of a crew of 10 souls. 4 ghosts in tattered flight gear, trapped in the very heart of the city they themselves had been burning from a height of 8,000 meters, about 26,000 feet. Hunger was not just a feeling of emptiness in the stomach. No, it was a living thing. It stirred inside them, gnawed at their bones, drank their blood, and whispered mad thoughts into their ears. The voice of Lieutenant Evans, the co-pilot, sounded like the screech of rusty hinges. He was lying on a pile of some rotten rags, and his leg... O'Connell tried not to look at the leg. It had been broken up there, in the sky, during the fall, and had now turned into a shapeless blue-black stump, exuding a sweet, nauseating smell. Evans was delirious. He spoke of his farm in Ohio, of the smell of mown grass, of the taste of fresh milk. He spoke, and his comrades listened, every word a form of torture. Nearby, curled into a ball, sat Sergeant Mike Miller, the tail gunner. The youngest of them, he had barely turned 20. His eyes, once clear and mocking, were now the eyes of a 100-year-old man, dull, sunken, filled with a primal terror. He no longer cried. The tears had run out yesterday. Now he just stared at a single point, slowly rocking back and forth. And then there was Lieutenant David Goldstein, the navigator. He alone maintained a semblance of discipline. He sat slightly apart. A miraculously intact, scorched-edged map of the city spread across his knees, tracing a finger across it, muttering something soundlessly. He was looking for a way out, looking for logic in this apocalyptic chaos. But there was no logic. O'Connell knew this. He closed his eyes. There was no ringing in his ears. No. There was silence. But this was not the silence of a peaceful world. This was the silence of death. The silence of a ruined city where even sounds had died. It was crushing, sucking out the last of their strength. "Captain." Goldstein's voice was hoarse, as if he were speaking through sandpaper. "The water's almost gone. A few more sips for all of us." O'Connell didn't open his eyes. He knew. He could feel his own tongue swelling, turning into a piece of dry leather. "And Evans?" he asked, and his own voice surprised him. It was a stranger's. "He's getting worse, sir. Fever. He doesn't know where he is anymore." The silence thickened. It became almost tangible. And in that silence, the thought O'Connell had been pushing away for a day had grown, strengthened, and now echoed in his mind with deafening clarity. He opened his eyes and looked at his men, at the delirious Evans, at the catatonic Miller, at Goldstein, waiting for a decision. He was their captain. He was responsible for their lives, and he had to make a decision. A terrible one. Inhuman. But the only one possible. He slowly rose, leaning a hand against the cold wall. His legs were shaking. He walked over to Evans and knelt beside him. The co-pilot opened his eyes, and for a moment, a flicker of recognition crossed them. "Jack, are we home?" he whispered. O'Connell placed his heavy hand on the man's burning forehead. "Yeah, buddy, we're almost home." He looked at Goldstein. Their eyes met. In the navigator's gaze there was no judgment, no fear, only understanding and infinite exhaustion. How had they come to this? How had the heroes of the sky, knights on steel birds, turned into a pack of cornered rats, willing to do anything for another sip of water, for another day of life? To understand how the captain of an American bomber reached a decision that would forever brand his soul, we must go back 72 hours. To the moment their world, smelling of aviation fuel and hope, had shattered and burned in the damn skies over Berlin. 3 days before that hell, B-17G with tail number 448357 and the proud name The Untouchable was not a steel coffin but a home, a fortress of aluminum and plexiglass, flying at an altitude of 8,000 meters, about 26,000 feet, in the icy blue of the March sky. Inside this home was its own world, its own rhythm, its own laws. The air was thin and smelled of ozone, machine oil, and human sweat. The monotonous, all-consuming roar of the 4 Wright Cyclone engines wasn't noise. It was the soundtrack of their lives, a lullaby and a battle march all in one. Captain John O'Connell felt the vibration through his entire body. It resonated in his bones, his teeth, the tips of his fingers resting on the yoke. This was the music of his war. He was leading his bird as part of a giant armada. Hundreds of identical silver machines stretching to the horizon like a deadly steel river. Below, under a thin veil of clouds, lay enemy land. From this height, it looked peaceful, almost like a toy. Neat squares of fields, ribbons of roads, tiny houses. It was hard to believe that down there, hatred was boiling. From up here, war was an abstraction, a mathematical problem. There was a point on a map, a target. There was a bomb bay full of presence. There was a course, a speed, and an altitude. Clean, cold work. The co-pilot, Lieutenant Bill Evans, a good-natured farm boy from Ohio, was whistling some popular tune. He always did that before the target. It calmed him. "What do you think, Jack?" he yelled over the roar of the engines. "Will we make it back for baseball season?" O'Connell smirked, not taking his eyes off the instruments. "Only if the season doesn't start next week, Bill." In their little world, everything was in its place. In the nose compartment, in his glass bubble, Lieutenant David Goldstein, the navigator, was hunched over his maps. For him, the war was a web of lines, numbers, and calculations. He was the brain of this flying organism, its eyes that saw the unseen. Next to him, Sergeant Russo, the bombardier, worked his magic with his Norden bomb sight, a highly complex and top-secret device that could supposedly drop a bomb into a pickle barrel from 10,000 meters, over 32,000 feet. In the central compartment, the waist gunners stood watch at their machine guns, and in the very tail, in a separate, lonely, and windswept compartment, sat Sergeant Mike Miller, nicknamed Kid. He was only 19, and this was his 5th combat mission. He looked at the receding line of friendly planes, at the contrails their engines left in the clear sky, and wrote a letter to his girlfriend in Brooklyn. He wrote about how beautiful it was up here, how the sun flooded the cabin, and that soon, very soon, he would be back, and they would get married. He didn't know yet that this letter would never be sent. And in the radio room, in the heart of the plane, sat Master Sergeant Frank Callahan, Pops, the oldest and most experienced of the crew. He didn't join in the chatter. He listened to the airwaves. He listened to the terse commands, the reports, and through them, the quiet crackle of static that was the voice of the void, the voice of space, the voice of fate. They said old radio operators could predict if a mission would be lucky, just by the character of the static. That day, according to those who later tried to piece together what happened, Callahan was unusually silent. His face, usually calm and unflappable, was like a mask. The omens were everywhere, but no one wanted to see them. Intelligence had reported an unusual concentration of anti-aircraft batteries around Berlin. The weather began to worsen, the cloud cover thickening, hindering precise aiming. And then there was that feeling, a sticky, cold premonition that settles somewhere in the pit of your stomach, one that experienced pilots learned to respect. O'Connell felt it as they crossed the coast. Something was wrong. The air seemed to have thickened, become heavy, hostile. He glanced at Evans. The co-pilot had stopped whistling. "Black dots, 11 o'clock, low," came Goldstein's calm voice in the headphones. It was them. Messerschmitts. They were rising to meet them, tiny as insects, but deadly. And then the ground below came alive. Hundreds of flashes pierced the clouds, and the sky around the untouchable blossomed with black venomous flowers of exploding flak shells. The plane shook violently. Shrapnel drummed against the fuselage like hail. It was a familiar ritual, a dance with death they had almost grown used to. The main thing was to hold formation. In formation, you were part of a force, protected by the fire of your neighbors. Alone, you were finished. "Target in sight," Russo reported. "Beginning my bombing run." At that moment, O'Connell still believed it would be a routine mission. Tough, dangerous, but routine. He would do his job, drop his bombs, turn around, and lead his machine home to England. In the evening, they would drink cheap whiskey in the pub, laughing as they recalled the most dangerous moments, feeling immortal. He glanced at the photograph of his wife taped to the instrument panel and silently promised her he would return. He didn't know that the impact he would hear in a few minutes wouldn't be just another piece of shrapnel hitting the armor. It would be the blow of fate that would shatter their world into before and after, and cast them from the heavens into the very furnace of a man-made hell. It happened suddenly without warning. There was no whistle, no howl, just a deafening, crushing impact that seemed to tear the very air apart. The entire world of the B-17 shuddered like a living creature dealt a mortal wound. For Captain O'Connell, time stretched for a moment, turning into a viscous, syrupy substance. He saw the instrument panel before him crack, the needles on the dials dance a frantic jig. The yoke in his hands jerked with such force it nearly dislocated his shoulders. The plane pitched forward violently, falling into an air pocket. The roar of the engines was replaced by the piercing, soul-shattering screech of tortured metal. Somewhere behind him, a scream erupted, instantly drowned in the chaos of sound. "Fire in engine 3, Evans reported, his voice surprisingly calm, but with a steel edge. "Fire suppression system failed." O'Connell glanced to his right. Through the plexiglass of the cockpit, he saw what every pilot fears. The wing of his fortress was engulfed in tongues of bright orange flame, greedily devouring the aluminum skin, leaving a trail of thick black smoke. It was a death sentence. A direct hit from an 88mm flak shell. The untouchable was mortally wounded. It was dying. "Hold formation," he roared into the intercom, though he knew the order was pointless. "Russo, bombs away. Immediately!" He needed to lighten the plane, try to level it out, to limp back toward friendly lines. But the aircraft was no longer responding. It had become an uncontrollable piece of burning metal, hurtling toward the earth. "Bombs away," Russo reported. The plane bucked slightly, but it changed nothing. The fall continued. "Kid, report your status," O'Connell shouted. The only response from the headphones was static and someone's moan. Contact with the tail section was lost. The initial shock began to fade, replaced by an icy, crystal-clear realization. This was it. They weren't going to make it. They were going down. Straight into Berlin. Into the city they had just bombed. The irony was so cruel he wanted to laugh. A crazed, hysterical laugh. "Bail out," O'Connell ordered. His voice didn't waver. He was the commander, and he would remain so until the very last second. "Jump! Everybody jump!" Goldstein was the first out of the cockpit. He gave the captain a quick, desperate look and vanished through the emergency hatch. Russo followed him. Evans tried to help the captain hold the yoke, but O'Connell pushed him away. "Go, Bill! That's an order!" Evans nodded, his face as pale as a sheet. As he made his way to the exit, the plane lurched violently again. Bill lost his balance and slammed his leg against a metal strut. He cried out in pain, but managed to reach the hatch and tumble out. Now O'Connell was alone in the agonizing machine. Smoke filled the cockpit, stinging his eyes. He couldn't breathe. He took one last look at his wife's photograph. "I'm sorry," he whispered. And unbuckling his harness, he lunged for the exit. The jump was a leap into nothingness. For one brief, deafening moment, there was silence. All the roaring, scraping, and crashing was left up there, in his dying airplane. He fell in silence, tumbling through the air. He pulled the ripcord. A jerk, a sharp pain in his shoulders, and then he was hanging under a white silk canopy, slowly descending into the very heart of the apocalypse. The scene that unfolded before him was surreal and monstrous. The entire city below was a sea of fire and smoke. Huge black columns rose to the sky, mingling with the clouds and turning day into twilight. He saw his fortress, his home, his untouchable, break apart as it fell, crashing somewhere in an industrial district and causing a gigantic fiery explosion. Other canopies blossomed in the sky around him. His boys. He tried to count them. 1, 2, 3, 4. He didn't know who had survived and who had remained in the plane. He descended lower, and the abstract picture of destruction below began to take on horrifying detail. He saw the skeletons of houses with the empty eye sockets of windows. He saw streets choked with rubble. He was flying straight into the hell he himself had helped create. The landing was hard. He hit the slope of the mountain of broken bricks and concrete, rolled several meters, and came to a stop, tangled in his parachute lines. He lay there, breathing heavily, trying to regain his senses. The air here, on the ground, was different. It smelled of death. It smelled of burnt stone, smoldering wood, and something else, something sweet and nauseating he didn't even want to think about. He freed himself from the parachute and looked around. He was in the center of a giant labyrinth of ruins. There wasn't a living soul in sight. Only a silence broken by the crackle of dying fires and a distant, barely audible hum. He was alone. An enemy in enemy territory. He drew his service Colt and checked the magazine. 7 rounds against an entire city. He looked at his own terrified, trembling hands, then at the endless ruins around him, and in that moment, he understood. If they were to survive, he had to become more than their commander. He had to become their jailer, their dictator, and perhaps their god. Because down here, the old rules no longer applied. A new, terrifying law was beginning, the law of survival. The first hours on the ground were like a nightmare from which he couldn't wake. O'Connell's mind refused to accept reality. He wandered through the dead city, stumbling over rebar and falling into bomb craters. Each step echoed in the deafening silence. The state of shock gradually gave way to a sharp, almost animalistic sense of danger. He was an outsider here. His uniform, his language, his very appearance, everything screamed that he was the enemy. He ripped the insignia from his jacket and tried to make himself look as inconspicuous as possible, but it was useless. He was an American airman in the heart of the Third Reich, a target. He had to find his men. It was the only thought beating in his mind like a trapped bird. He didn't know where they had landed, or if they had survived at all. He began moving in the direction where he thought their plane had crashed, using a column of black smoke as his guide. He moved cautiously, hiding behind the hulks of burned-out cars and the walls of destroyed buildings. The city wasn't just destroyed, it was gutted. Moans could be heard from some of the basements, but O'Connell didn't dare approach. Who was down there? Wounded civilians? Or a trap? He crossed what had once been a wide avenue. Now it was a gorge filled with debris. An overturned, empty baby carriage lay on the side. That image seared itself into his memory more sharply than any shrapnel. These weren't just targets on a map. These were lives. Thousands of lives. And he was one of those who had pulled the trigger. Suddenly he heard voices, German, sharp, guttural. He froze, pressing himself against the remnants of a wall. 2 figures emerged from around a corner. An old man in a Volkssturm uniform with an ancient rifle and a boy of about 14 in a Hitler Youth uniform clutching a Panzerfaust. They were walking, looking around. O'Connell held his breath. His finger rested on the trigger of his Colt. His heart pounded so loudly he thought they would hear it a block away. The patrol passed by without noticing him. When their footsteps faded, he allowed himself to exhale. The enemy was not an army. The enemy was everyone. Old men, children. People who had no business being in a war. He realized that searching for his men during the day was suicide. He needed to find cover, to wait for darkness. He crawled into the basement of a half-demolished building. It reeked of damp and decay. In a corner, he found a puddle of rainwater mixed with dust. He knelt and drank from it greedily. The water was warm and tasted of cement, but it was the best water he had ever had. It was in this basement that he found the first of his men. He heard a faint moan from the far corner. Gripping his pistol, he moved slowly toward the sound. In the darkness, he made out a figure in a flight suit. It was Goldstein. The navigator was wounded. A piece of shrapnel had pierced his shoulder, but luckily, it hadn't hit the bone. "Captain," he whispered as O'Connell leaned over him. "I thought I was alone." They didn't embrace. They didn't speak grand words. They just looked at each other, and in that gaze was everything. Relief, fear, and the understanding that their nightmare was just beginning. Goldstein told him he had seen another parachute land, somewhere to the east. It might have been one of their crew. At night, under the cover of darkness, they set out to search. Moving through the city at night was even more terrifying. Every sound made them flinch. The moon, breaking through the smoke, illuminated the ruins, giving them a sinister, otherworldly appearance. They moved like ghosts, trying to stay in the shadows. That's when they met her, the woman. She was sitting on a pile of rubble, her arms wrapped around her knees, rocking back and forth and muttering to herself. Her clothes were in tatters, her hair matted and covered in ash. She looked like an ancient sorceress mourning a dead world. Seeing them, she didn't scream. She slowly raised her head, and her eyes, empty and insane, bored into them. She stood up, drew herself to her full height, and a single word, filled with such concentrated hatred that it sent a chill down their spines, escaped her lips. Mortar. Murderers. Then she simply spat at their feet and sat back down on the stones, resuming her quiet muttering. That spit was worse than a gunshot. It held all the pain, all the fury of this city. O'Connell and Goldstein hurried away. They found the others over the next few hours. First Russo, hiding in a bomb crater. Then Miller, who had wedged himself into a niche in a wall, crying like a child. They found Evans last. He was lying unconscious at the foot of a huge pile of debris, his leg twisted at an unnatural angle. When they were all gathered in the basement of some administrative building, the brief moment of joy at their reunion quickly gave way to the realization of the scale of the disaster. There were 5 of them. 1 was seriously wounded. They had 1 pistol with 7 rounds, 2 knives, and no supplies. Around them was a hostile city teeming with patrols and embittered civilians. "We have to surrender." Miller was the first to break the silence, his voice trembling. "Find a Wehrmacht patrol. We're prisoners of war, the Geneva Convention." O'Connell gave him a hard look. "Kid, did you see that woman's eyes? Did you see that old man with the rifle? There is no Geneva Convention here. There is only hatred. To them, we're not soldiers. We're monsters who fell from the sky. Our uniform is a death sentence. From this moment on, we are ghosts. We are not here. We move only at night. We make no sound. We drink dirty water and eat what we can find. Our goal is east. Break through to the Russians. It's our only chance." He looked around at his men. Goldstein and Russo nodded silently. Miller lowered his head. Evans moaned in his sleep. The basement was cold and damp. The adrenaline had worn off and a monstrous exhaustion set in. They sat in the darkness listening to the sounds of the dying city. It felt like the end. But it was then that the quiet and pragmatic Goldstein, who had been studying an evacuation plan he'd found on the wall, spoke the words that were both madness and their only hope. "Captain, according to this plan, there's an old sewer main beneath us. And if I'm not mistaken, it leads to the main reservoir. There should be water there." Goldstein's idea was a lifeline they clung to with the desperation of drowning men. The thought of clean water, of quenching a thirst that had become a physical agony, spurred them into action. Finding the entrance to the sewer was not easy. The manhole indicated on the plan was buried under tons of broken bricks and twisted metal. For hours, they worked, exhausted and weak, clearing the rubble with their bare hands. Their palms were rubbed raw. Their muscles burned, but they toiled in a silent, ferocious trance. Finally, they managed to move the last piece of debris and pry open the heavy cast iron lid. A blast of stale, damp, and cold air rose from the opening. It was the smell of hope. The descent was risky. They tied the wounded Evans with parachute cords and carefully lowered him down. Then they followed. At the bottom, they were met with absolute, impenetrable darkness. A darkness that doesn't exist on the surface, even on the blackest night. And silence. After the constant crackle of fires and the howl of wind in the ruins, this subterranean quiet was deafening. The only sound was the dripping of water somewhere ahead. They lit one of the few matches Goldstein had. The dim flame snatched from the gloom walls covered in slimy green mold and ankle-deep water. The sewer was wide. They could walk almost without bending over. This was their new world, their sanctuary and their prison. They moved forward, toward the sound of dripping water. O'Connell and Russo carried Evans. Miller walked behind, constantly glancing back at the black square of the manhole, as if afraid it would close forever. Goldstein, clutching the precious map, led the way, lighting their path with the last of the matches. Every step in the icy water was a jolt of pain in their weary legs, but they pressed on. After an hour of wandering through this labyrinth, they emerged into a huge chamber. In the center, a thin but steady stream of water trickled from a crack in the ceiling, forming a small underground lake. It was a victory. Their first real victory. They drank the water like madmen. They washed their grimy, soot-covered faces with it. They cleaned Goldstein's wound and moistened the lips of Evans, who was now barely conscious. That water gave them more than just strength. It gave them back their faith, the faith that they could survive. They set up camp in the underground chamber. Goldstein, their unexpected savior, their genius, became their Moses, leading his people out of the desert. His map, his knowledge, his ability to think logically in the midst of chaos became their greatest weapon. He studied the map of Berlin's underground utilities. It was an entire empire hidden beneath the ruins. Tunnels, sewers, old subway lines. This was their road to the east, their path to salvation. Respect for the navigator grew with every hour. He, the quiet, intellectual Jewish kid from New York whom some of the crew had initially considered too bookish for the war, had proven to be the best equipped to survive in this stone hell. He didn't panic. He analyzed. He looked for solutions. Russo, the pragmatic and straightforward bombardier who had previously relied only on his strength and his Norden bomb sight, now looked at Goldstein with genuine admiration. "That guy," he told O'Connell as they sat by their underground lake. "He sees right through the city, like he's got X-ray vision." This first victory changed them. It united them. They realized their strength wasn't in a pistol with 7 rounds, but in themselves. In O'Connell's discipline, in Goldstein's knowledge, in Rousseau's strength, even Miller's fear had its use. It made them doubly cautious. But their little underground paradise was fragile. They had conquered thirst, but hunger had not disappeared. It continued to gnaw at them from within. And Evans was getting worse. The fever wouldn't break, and his leg was even more swollen. He needed medical attention, antibiotics, which they did not have. They knew they couldn't stay here for long. They had to move, find food, find a way out. One night, O'Connell and Rousseau ventured out on a sortie. They emerged onto the surface through another manhole several blocks from their shelter. The city was just as dead. They crept into the ruins of a bakery. Everything was burned and looted. But in the basement, under a layer of ash and rubble, Rousseau found several sacks of flour. Hardened, damp, but it was food. They stuffed their jackets with the priceless treasure. As they were about to leave, they heard footsteps, directly above them on the street. They froze. The steps were heavy, shuffling. There were many of them. Voices, quiet, exhausted. They peeked through a crack in the rubble, and they saw a procession of ghosts. Dozens of people, mostly women and old men, were shuffling down the street, pushing carts. They walked in silence, their heads bowed. Their faces were gray with dust and hunger. O'Connell understood. These were the survivors. The ones who hid in basements during the day and came out at night to forage for food. Their competitors, their enemies in the struggle for survival. They had conquered thirst, but now they had to enter a new, even more terrifying battle. The battle for food. And they didn't know that their small victory, their discovery in the bakery basement, had already attracted the attention of other inhabitants of this hell. Those who were hungrier and meaner. Returning to their underground shelter with the precious flour, they felt like kings for a moment. Rousseau, who had helped his father in an Italian bakery before the war, mixed the flour with water from their underground lake, and, on a heated piece of metal over a makeshift fire of wood splinters, baked something that vaguely resembled bread. It was the best bread of their lives, hard with a taste of cement and char, but it filled their stomachs and gave them strength. Inspired by this success, they began to build their small underground empire. Life fell into a strict, almost military rhythm. O'Connell, as he had promised himself, became their dictator. But his dictatorship was aimed at salvation. He established laws. First, strict rationing of food and water. Everyone received their share and not a crumb more. The penalty for theft was exile to the surface, a death sentence. Second, absolute silence. No loud talking, no noise. Third, movement on the surface only at night, only in pairs, and only with his permission. Goldstein was their Minister of Navigation and Planning. He studied maps, plotted routes through the underground networks, and marked potential supply locations on the plan. Warehouses, shops, hospitals. Rousseau became the chief of the provision service. He was responsible for sorties and preparing food. Miller, the youngest and most sharp-eyed, was appointed the main lookout. He would sit for hours by the manholes, listening to the sounds above, and his hearing, sharpened by fear, saved them more than once. They had created their own microcosm with its own rules and hierarchy. This routine, this system they built in the midst of absolute chaos, gave them something more than just a chance at physical survival. It gave them purpose. It was saving their sanity. They were no longer just victims abandoned to fate. They were an organization, a crew that was still carrying out a combat mission, albeit the strangest one of their lives. The mission to survive. Their little empire grew. During one sortie, they stumbled upon a collapsed civil defense warehouse. There they found several crates of canned goods, bandages, iodine, and most importantly, several jerry cans of kerosene for lamps. Now they had not only light, but also the ability to boil water. They even managed to rig up a sort of operating theater for Evans. O'Connell, using fragments of knowledge from a first aid course, lanced his wound, removed the shrapnel, and disinfected it. It was a brutal procedure. Evans screamed, but afterward, he seemed to get a little better. The fever broke. They felt almost invincible in their subterranean world. They learned to read the sounds from above. They knew when a patrol was passing, when an artillery barrage began, and when the city fell into a dead silence. They were shadows, ghosts, living beneath the feet of their enemies. But this stability, this sense of control, was an illusion. And it was this illusion that created the first crack in their brotherhood. The conflict began with Miller. The kid had never fully accepted their new reality. He followed orders, but terror was a constant presence in his eyes. He slept poorly, plagued by nightmares. He still believed in the Geneva Convention, in the rules of war, in the idea that if they surrendered to the right soldiers, everything would be fine. "We can't live here like rats forever," he said one evening as they sat in the light of the kerosene lamp. "We have to try. There's not just Volkssturm up there. There are Wehrmacht units, soldiers. They'll understand. They'll take us prisoner. They'll shoot us on sight, Miller," O'Connell replied calmly without looking up. "Or they'll hand us over to a mob. We're not soldiers to them." "How do you know?" Miller's voice turned hysterical. "We haven't even tried. We're just hiding. I can't do this anymore. I want to see the sun. I'd rather die up there than rot in this stinking hole." "You won't die alone," Russo cut him off harshly. "You'll get us all killed." The tension in their underground chamber became almost palpable. Evans stirred restlessly on his makeshift bed. Goldstein stared silently at the map as if it held the answer. O'Connell knew this wasn't just hysterics. It was a rebellion. A rebellion of despair against his iron discipline. And if he didn't crush it now, their little empire would collapse. Their life had found a harsh but predictable rhythm. But not everyone was prepared to live by the laws of this new world. In the darkness of their underground shelter, a mutiny began to brew. A mutiny that could destroy them all. The confrontation was inevitable. It hung in the stale subterranean air like a thundercloud. O'Connell knew that words would no longer work. Miller's fear was irrational. It had become an obsession, and that obsession was contagious. The captain saw Russo clenching his fists, saw Goldstein nervously fidgeting with the edge of the map. If Miller broke, he could drag the others down with him. The climax came the following night. O'Connell awoke with a strange premonition. He surveyed their camp. Miller was not in his spot. The captain leaped to his feet. He found the kid by one of the distant manholes they didn't use. The sergeant had already managed to partially slide open the heavy cover. "Miller, halt!" O'Connell's voice was like a gunshot in the underground silence. Miller flinched and spun around. In the beam of the flashlight, his face was twisted with a crazed determination. He was clutching one of their kitchen knives. "Don't come any closer, Captain," he hissed. "I've made up my mind. I'm going up, and no one is going to stop me." "You're not going alone," O'Connell said slowly, deliberately, taking a step forward. "You'll lead them right to us." "You'll kill everyone. Evans, Goldstein, Russo. Is that what you want?" "They'll find us anyway," Miller screamed. "We can't hide forever. I have a chance. I'll tell them I was alone, that I got separated." He was rambling, his eyes wild. He was on the edge. This was no longer just insubordination. It was a betrayal, driven not by malice, but by animal terror. Russo and Goldstein, awakened by the shouting, were already running toward them. "Easy, kid," Russo said gently, holding his hands out. "Let's just talk." "Stay back," Miller shrieked, brandishing the knife. "I mean it." In that moment, O'Connell knew he had to act. He had to apply that surgical cruelty he had contemplated in the first minutes after the crash. He had to become a monster to save his men from themselves. He took another step forward, looking Miller straight in the eye. "You are not leaving this place, Sergeant. That is an order." "To hell with your orders!" Miller lunged at him. O'Connell was ready. He didn't try to block the knife. He dodged, letting Miller's arm fly past, then seized his wrist and twisted it sharply. The knife clattered to the stone floor. Simultaneously, O'Connell delivered a short, precise punch to the solar plexus. Miller doubled over, gasping for air. He was disarmed and neutralized in seconds. But O'Connell didn't stop. He grabbed the limp sergeant by the collar, slammed him against the wall, and delivered several short, sharp slaps to his face. "You will not kill us," he enunciated each word, staring into the young gunner's crazed eyes. Miller went limp, tears streaming down his cheeks. The hysteria was gone, leaving only emptiness and shame in its wake. Russo and Goldstein watched the scene in silence. There was no judgment in their eyes. They understood that the captain had just saved all of them. O'Connell released Miller, who slid down the wall to the floor. He sat there, his face in his hands, his shoulders shaking with silent sobs. A heavy silence fell. The conflict was over. The captain's authority was restored, but the cost was high. Something had broken within their small brotherhood. Trust had been shattered. O'Connell picked up the knife. He looked at his men, at the defeated Miller, and felt not triumph, but only the bitter taste of ash in his mouth. He had saved them, but to do it, he'd had to get his hands dirty, to break one of his own men. He returned to his spot and sat down, placing the pistol on his lap. He would stand watch until morning. He could no longer trust anyone but himself. He had defended his law. The mutiny was crushed. But while they were dealing with their internal conflict, they had become less vigilant. They had broken one of their cardinal rules, the rule of silence. Miller's scream, the sounds of the struggle, the clang of the dropped knife, they weren't loud, but in the dead city, even a whisper could be a death sentence. They hadn't noticed that their real external enemy, who had been nearby all along, had heard them. And as they licked their internal wounds, that enemy was already preparing its final, devastating strike. The next few days passed in a tense, oppressive silence. Miller became a shadow. He ate when given food, slept when it was his turn, but spoke to no one, avoiding the captain's gaze. O'Connell made no attempt to comfort or scold him. The incident was closed. Survival demanded they move on. But the atmosphere in their underground kingdom had changed. The easy camaraderie was gone, replaced by a grim, detached efficiency. They continued their journey east, moving through the labyrinth of sewers at night, guided by Goldstein's genius. They had already passed the city center and reached the industrial outskirts. Their destination was an old, abandoned factory that, according to the navigator's calculations, was just a few kilometers, a couple of miles from the presumed front line. This was their final hurdle, their greatest hope. The factory was a giant complex of semi-destroyed workshops, connected by a network of underground passages. The perfect place to hide and wait for the Soviet troops. They found it. Entering the grounds through a service tunnel, they found themselves in a vast, echoing assembly hall. Dim daylight filtered through the bombed-out roof, illuminating the skeletons of machines coated in rust and dust. It was relatively safe here. They decided to make it their final base. Their supplies of food and kerosene were running out. Evans had taken a turn for the worse. The brief improvement had been temporary. The infection was winning. He was unconscious most of the time, and his breathing grew more shallow. They all knew that if they didn't get help in the next day or two, he would die. This spurred them on. It was here, in this industrial crypt, that fate dealt its blow. They were discovered. It happened at dawn. Miller, on watch at one of the broken windows, noticed movement. He didn't shout. He quietly approached the captain and touched his shoulder. "Sir, there are people out there." O'Connell went to the window. Below, among the rubble, he saw them. It wasn't the army. It was a patrol of teenagers in Hitler Youth uniforms and several old men from the Volkssturm. There were about 10 of them. They were armed with a motley collection of weapons, old rifles, a few pistols. One boy had a Panzerfaust. They were clearly searching the ruins, and they were heading straight for their workshop. "Everyone to positions," O'Connell commanded quietly. "Hold your fire until I give the order." They spread out through the hall, taking cover behind machines and columns. Hearts pounded. But this wasn't the fear they had felt in the sky. This was a different, dirty, terrestrial horror. They were about to fight children and old men. The patrol entered the workshop. They moved cautiously but clumsily, making a lot of noise. They were led by a boy of about 16 with a fanatical glint in his eyes. He was obviously the leader. They began to search the area. One of the old men stumbled upon one of their empty tin cans. He picked it up, examined the English lettering, and shouted. That was it. They were found. "Surrender, American pigs!" the boy leader yelled, his voice cracking with tension. Silence was the only reply. "Throw down your weapons and come out with your hands up." O'Connell knew that surrender was death. These boys, pumped full of propaganda, and these old men who had lost everything, would not take prisoners. They would tear them apart on the spot. He looked at Russo. He nodded. He looked at Goldstein. He was gripping his knife. Even Miller seemed to have found a kind of grim resolve. His fear of captivity was outweighed by his fear of death. "Fire," O'Connell commanded. His shot from the Colt echoed through the vast hall like a thunderclap. The fight began. If you could call it a fight. It was a sickening, chaotic slaughter. The Germans fired erratically, their bullets chipping chunks of concrete from the columns. The Americans, sheltered behind massive machines, returned fire with sparse but accurate shots. They were professionals against amateurs, but the enemy had numbers and desperate fury on their side. One of the old men tried to flank them, but Russo took him down with a well-aimed knife throw. The boy leader, shouting slogans, tried to fire his Panzerfaust, but Goldstein leaped from behind cover and slammed a piece of rebar against his arms. The battle devolved into a series of short, brutal skirmishes in the semi-darkness of the workshop. There was no heroism, no glory, only the screech of metal, screams, gasps, and the smell of gunpowder. In the midst of this melee, a stray bullet hit a pile of barrels filled with some flammable liquid in a corner. There was an explosion, the hall filled with fire and acrid smoke. In the chaos, the wounded Evans, who was lying in the farthest corner, regained consciousness. He saw the fire, heard the gunshots. In his clouded consciousness, reality and delirium likely merged. He thought they were back in the falling plane. He scrambled to his feet, ignoring his broken leg, and with a cry of, "Bail out, boys, bail out!" he threw himself directly into the flames. O'Connell saw it happen. He screamed, tried to stop him, but it was too late. The co-pilot's figure became a human torch for an instant, then collapsed. Evans's death was the price of their survival. The explosion and the fire threw the attackers into a panic. They broke and began to retreat, carrying their wounded. The Americans didn't pursue them. They sat in the smoke, stunned, devastated, staring at the smoldering body of their comrade. They had won. But the price of that victory was terrible. They were on the verge of complete physical and moral collapse. And it was in that moment, in the silence that followed the battle, that they heard a new sound. It wasn't the crack of gunfire or German voices. It was a low, rumbling roar, the roar of tank engines, and it was getting closer. The roar grew louder, filling the space, vibrating through the floor, the walls, their very bones. It was the sound they had been waiting for, the sound they had hoped for all these endless days. But now, after everything they had endured, it brought not joy, but a new, irrational fear. Who was it? Friend? Foe? O'Connell, Russo, and Goldstein, leaving Miller, who sat catatonic beside Evans's body, cautiously made their way to the farthest, least damaged window of the workshop. What they saw took their breath away. A column of tanks was moving down the wide, rubble-strewn street. They were not German Tigers or Panthers. Their rough, angular silhouettes, long-barreled cannons, and the red stars on their turrets left no doubt. They were T-34s. It was the Red Army. Salvation. It had arrived. Russo let out a choked, joyful sound and was about to lean out the window, to wave his arms, but O'Connell pulled him back sharply. "Quiet," he hissed. "Don't be hasty." His intuition, honed to a razor's edge, told him it was too early to celebrate. The tanks stopped. Soldiers in dirty, faded jackets jumped down from the armor. Their faces were weary, weather-beaten, and hard. These were not parade troops. These were assault units that had fought their way across hundreds of kilometers. They moved quickly, professionally, without unnecessary words. Some began to take up positions, while others moved toward the nearest buildings to clear them. They were here, on the front line. The euphoria of rescue that had momentarily gripped them began to fade quickly, replaced by a sober and cold realization. To these Soviet soldiers, what were they? Allies or just more armed men holed up in the ruins? How could they explain who they were? In the broken Russian that only Goldstein knew? O'Connell made a decision. "We're going out. No weapons, hands up. Goldstein, you do the talking." He walked over to Miller. "Kid, get up." "It's over." Miller looked up at him with empty eyes, then glanced at Evans's body and slowly, like an old man, got to his feet. They tossed their Colton knives out into the open. O'Connell took one last look at the remains of his co-pilot. "I'm sorry, Bill. We did everything we could." And they walked out of the workshop. Slowly, with their hands raised, they stepped from the semi-darkness into the gray light of the street. They were spotted immediately. Several submachine gun barrels swiveled in their direction. A sharp, guttural command rang out. "Stoi! Ruki za golovu! Halt! Hands on your head!" Goldstein, pale but composed, stepped forward. "My Amerikanci!" he shouted in Russian, his accent terrible. "Lyochiki! Soyuzniki! We are Americans, airmen, allies." The soldiers exchanged glances. An officer, a young lieutenant with tired but sharp eyes, emerged from behind a tank. He approached them, his TT pistol at the ready. He looked them up and down, tattered, filthy uniforms, gaunt faces covered in stubble. They didn't look like the shining heroes from propaganda posters. They looked like ghosts. "Americans?" the lieutenant asked doubtfully. "What are you doing here?" As best he could, Goldstein began to tell their story. About the downed plane, about surviving in the ruins, about the last fight in the workshop. The lieutenant listened in silence, his face betraying no emotion. When Goldstein finished, he nodded to his soldiers. "Search them." They were searched, roughly, unceremoniously. They took everything they had. Goldstein's map, an empty canteen, the photograph of O'Connell's wife. When a soldier reached for the photo, the captain flinched, but was immediately jabbed in the back with a rifle. The lieutenant took the photograph, turned it over in his hands, and stuffed it into his pocket. To him, it wasn't a relic. It was just a trophy. "You'll come with us," he said, not returning the picture. "Smersh will figure out who you are." Salvation had turned into a new form of captivity. They were not embraced as brothers in arms. They were looked upon with suspicion. They were marched under guard through the streets of ruined Berlin, past soldiers just as tired and brutalized by the war as they were. As they walked, O'Connell stared at the back of the Soviet lieutenant, in whose pocket lay the photograph of his wife. He had survived. He had led his men out, but he felt no joy, no relief. He felt only a bottomless, icy void. He realized that their small, personal war was not over. It had just entered a new phase, a phase of interrogations, mistrust, and oblivion. Their feat, their survival in the hell they had helped create, turned out to be an unnecessary, inconvenient truth, and the system that had saved them was already preparing to deliver its verdict. A verdict that would be their final and most cruel blow. Their story did not end on the streets of Berlin. It dissolved in the faceless corridors and dusty offices of a military bureaucracy that has no tolerance for stories that deviate from regulations and official reports. The 4 surviving crew members of the B-17, the Untouchable, were handed over from Smersh counterintelligence to representatives of the Allied mission. But this was no triumphant return of heroes. It was a routine repatriation procedure conducted with cold formalism. Weeks of debriefings in filtration camps awaited them. They were interrogated again and again. First by Soviet counterintelligence, then by their own, by American security officers. Their story of survival in the Berlin underground, of clashes with the Volkssturm, of creating their empire in the ruins, sounded too incredible, too cinematic. No one wanted to believe it. Where was the proof? Where were the witnesses? Where were the bodies of their fallen comrades? Their words were compared with official reports. The plane with tail number 448357 was listed as missing in action over the target area. The crew as killed in action. Rising from the dead is not customary in the military system. It disrupts order. To the investigators, their story was either a fabrication to cover up cowardice and desertion, or worse, a story concocted under the direction of German or Soviet intelligence. Captain John O'Connell was interrogated longer and more harshly than the others. He was blamed for the loss of the aircraft, for the deaths of 6 crew members. His leadership, his surgical cruelty that had saved them in the tunnels, was interpreted here, in a sterile office, as an abuse of authority and non-regulation conduct. They forced him to relive Evans's death, Miller's mutiny, every minute of their odyssey, over and over. They tried to break him, to find contradictions in his testimony. He didn't break. He simply withdrew into himself. He understood that the world he had fought for did not want to know the truth about war. It wanted beautiful legends about heroes, not a dirty, bloody story of survival. Lieutenant David Goldstein tried to fight. He wrote detailed reports, drew maps of their underground routes, and argued that their experience could be valuable for training other pilots. But his reports gathered dust in archives, stamped classified. He was considered an eccentric, a war-traumatized intellectual, trying to make sense of his experience through fantasy. Sergeant Russo chose a different path. He denied everything. During interrogations, he claimed he remembered nothing. Shock, amnesia. He understood the rules of the game. The less you say, the faster they leave you alone. He just wanted to go home, to his bakery, and forget everything like a bad dream. Mike Miller had it the worst. The young gunner's psyche couldn't take it. The guilt over his mutiny, the horror of what he had endured, and the pressure from interrogators finished him. He was discharged with a diagnosis of post-traumatic stress disorder. He returned to Brooklyn a broken man, who for the rest of his days was terrified of enclosed spaces and flinched at every loud noise. In the end, the investigation reached a dead end. It was impossible to prove their guilt, but no one was going to recognize them as heroes either. Their story was too inconvenient. It showed war from its unglamorous side. It told of how the enemy could be not just a soldier, but a child. Of how, to survive, one sometimes has to trample over everything they've been taught. They were simply lost in the system. O'Connell was demoted and sent to serve out his time as an instructor at some godforsaken airfield in Texas. Goldstein was transferred to a staff position, where he shuffled papers for the rest of the war. Russo was discharged for medical reasons. Their brotherhood, forged in the ruins of Berlin, was destroyed. They were forced to sign non-disclosure agreements. Their fate was officially buried in the archives. What became of them after the war? Their fates varied, but the shadow of Berlin haunted each of them. John O'Connell never returned to aviation. He got a job at the post office in his small Massachusetts town. He was a quiet, withdrawn man. His wife could never understand what had happened to her cheerful, confident husband. He never told her about those days. He died of a heart attack in 1968, quietly and unnoticed. David Goldstein became a history professor at a university. He dedicated his life to studying the Second World War, but never wrote or spoke of his own experience. His students considered him one of the foremost experts on cartography and urban tactics. None of them knew he had gained his knowledge not from books. He died at a ripe old age, leaving behind several foundational historical works that contained not a single word about the B-17, the untouchable. Frank Russo opened his bakery. He baked the best bread in the county and was the life of the party. But his family knew that he screamed in his sleep. He hated rats and basements. He died surrounded by his children and grandchildren and took his secret to the grave. Mike Miller did not live long. He couldn't adapt to civilian life. He drank heavily, couldn't hold a job. He was killed in a drunken brawl in 1952. He was only 27. He was buried in an old military cemetery, his headstone simply inscribed, Sergeant Michael Miller, veteran of World War II. But as is often the case, what official reports tried to erase was preserved in another unofficial memory. Official history forgot their names. In the endless lost lists of the 8th Air Force, the crew of the Untouchable remained under the heading Missing in Action. Their feat, their horror, their incredible will to live were erased, buried under tons of archival dust and a classified stamp. The system does not forgive those who survive outside the rules. But history is not only what is written in documents. It is also what is passed down in whispers, what lives in people's memories, what becomes legend. And the story of the 4 American airmen did not die. It just went underground, to the same place where they themselves had hidden from death, into the cellars and ruins of destroyed Berlin. It was said that among the Trümmerfrauen, the German women who cleared the rubble after the war, a strange tale was told, a tale of the ghosts from underground. They said that in the final, most terrible days of the city's assault, when hell reigned on the streets, inexplicable things happened in some districts. At night, strange, silent figures in tattered clothes would emerge from sewer manholes, searching for food and water, then vanish without a trace. They didn't rob, they didn't kill, they were just trying to survive. Some swore they had heard these ghosts speaking a strange, unfamiliar language. The legend grew with details. It was said that these ghosts once fought a squad of desperate Hitler Youth boys and defeated them, then disappeared as suddenly as they had appeared. It was said they were last seen when the Russian tanks entered the city. They simply walked out of the ruins with their hands up and dissolved into the chaos of war. This story became one of the many urban legends of a dying Berlin. It wasn't really believed, but it was told. Told in hushed tones, in breadlines, in cold, unheated apartments. It was part of the folklore, part of the mythology of the Great Catastrophe. No one knew who these ghosts were, but their story, distorted and embellished, lived on. And among the Soviet frontline soldiers, those who took Berlin, another tale circulated. About the strange Americans their advance unit had found in some abandoned factory. They said they looked like savages, overgrown, filthy, with wild eyes. It was said they had single-handedly fought off an entire Volkssturm unit, that they had lived underground for weeks, like moles. This story, too, was considered a soldier's tall tale, the kind born in the smoke of battle. But it was retold around campfires and field hospitals when reminiscing about the last days of the war. Thus, from fragments of memories, from soldiers' tales and urban legends, another unofficial history of the crew of the Untouchable was pieced together, a history that had no room for heroism in its poster-perfect sense. But it had something more. It had the truth of what a human being is capable of when cornered. The truth that the main enemy in war may not be the opposing army, but hunger, cold, and despair. The truth that the line between a hero and a monster, a savior and a killer, is sometimes thinner than a hair. This story is not just a chronicle of survival. It is a reminder that every war has 2 faces. One is the official face, captured in newsreels and the memoirs of generals. The other is a terrible, dirty face, one that can only be seen in the eyes of those who have passed through its hell and survived. Surviving not because of the war, but in spite of it. Their names are forgotten, their deeds are hidden, but their story, now a legend, proves one simple truth. You can destroy documents, you can force people into silence, but you cannot kill memory. Like life itself, it will always find a way to grow, even among the most terrible ruins.